In the summer of 1943, a German infantry officer named Kurt Bremer wrote a line into a report filed with his division headquarters in Sicily that his superiors would later circulate as a cautionary example for other units preparing to face American airborne troops. It read, "We shot at them all night, and they kept coming. In the morning we found they had taken the position anyway, using men we had already killed twice in our own reports." He was not exaggerating for effect. He was describing the specific and repeated experience of German units in Sicily and later in Normandy, who found themselves fighting soldiers of the 82nd Airborne Division, a formation the Wehrmacht would eventually give a name that started as a joke and ended as a warning. Fallschirmjäger nannten sie Teufel in Reithosen. The Paratroopers, they called them, devils in baggy pants. This is not a story told through American unit histories or the parade ground pride of the airborne tradition. This is a story assembled from German after-action reports, prisoner interrogation summaries, and the private notebooks of officers who had every professional reason to describe their enemy in dismissive terms, and who instead, again and again, reached for language that sounded less like a military assessment and more like a confession. To understand why the nickname mattered, you need to understand what German intelligence expected from American airborne forces before they ever encountered the 82nd in combat. Airborne infantry, by the doctrine of every major army fighting World War II, was considered a fragile instrument. Paratroopers jumped with limited ammunition, no heavy weapons, no armor, and no guarantee of link-up with friendly forces within any predictable time frame. German planners, who had used their own Fallschirmjäger to devastating effect at Crete in 1941 before suffering catastrophic casualties in that operation, understood better than most militaries exactly how vulnerable a scattered airborne force could be in the hours after a drop. The assumption, reasonable and doctrinally sound, was that American paratroopers dropped into hostile territory at night, frequently scattered miles from their intended drop zones by weather and anti-aircraft fire, would spend their first hours in a state of disorganized survival rather than offensive action. This assumption had been validated in earlier airborne operations by other nations. It was about to be tested against a division that treated a scattered drop not as a crisis to be endured, but as a tactical situation to be exploited. The 82nd Airborne Division's first major combat test came during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, an operation complicated from its opening minutes by high winds that scattered paratroopers of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment across a vast area of the island far beyond their planned drop zones, in groups ranging from a handful of men to isolated individuals with no immediate contact with any friendly unit. By any conventional military calculation, this should have neutralized the division's combat effectiveness for the critical opening hours of the invasion. Colonel Heinz Fassbender, a German regimental commander operating in the sector where much of the scattered drop occurred, filed a report describing what actually happened. He wrote, "Reports reached this headquarters throughout the night of isolated American parachutists engaging our positions, cutting communication lines, and ambushing supply columns across an area of terrain that should have made coordinated resistance impossible given their scattered dispersal. These were not organized units executing a plan. These were individuals in small groups who appeared to require no plan beyond finding the nearest opportunity to inflict damage." 4 words in that report deserve particular attention. Required no plan beyond. A professional German officer is describing an enemy whose scattered, disorganized condition, the exact condition doctrine predicted would produce paralysis, instead produced a kind of decentralized aggression that his own planning models had no category for. However, the tactical reality facing German forces in the days following the initial drop was considerably more disruptive than a single night of scattered skirmishing. As the scattered paratroopers of the 505th gradually made contact with one another and began consolidating into functional fighting units, they discovered they possessed a specific advantage precisely because of their scattered arrival. German rear area units, garrison troops, and supply columns operating well behind what should have been a secure front line found themselves under attack from directions that made no sense according to any conventional order of battle. Major Wilhelm Sacher, tasked with coordinating rear area security in the sector, wrote in a memorandum recovered after the campaign, "We have been unable to establish a reliable picture of enemy strength or positions in this sector, because engagement reports arrive from locations that our own maps would classify as securely held territory. Standard countermeasures assume an enemy who approaches from an identifiable direction along an identifiable axis. This enemy appears to require neither. Yet one variable remained systematically unaccounted for in the German assessments of the Sicily campaign, and it appears with striking consistency in reports filed by officers with no incentive to inflate the caliber of an American unit, their own doctrine considered inherently fragile by design. That variable concerned the specific willingness of small, isolated groups of American paratroopers, cut off from any realistic hope of reinforcement, supply, or extraction, to initiate offensive action against superior numbers rather than adopt a defensive posture focused purely on survival until relief arrived. German infantry doctrine, like most conventional doctrine of the period, assumed that an isolated unit's primary objective became self-preservation, a rational calculation that generally produced cautious defensive behavior until the tactical situation improved. Colonel Fassbender's report continued on this point directly. He wrote, "Prisoners taken from these scattered groups describe an operating assumption that appears to have preceded the jump itself, that isolation was to be treated as an operational condition rather than an emergency, and that the correct response to isolation was continued aggressive action rather than defensive consolidation. This is not the behavior our training would predict from any isolated infantry formation, allied or otherwise." The nickname itself, according to multiple German accounts collected after the campaign, originated from a specific and recurring detail of how American paratroopers dressed for combat. Their jump trousers, reinforced and heavily pocketed to carry extra ammunition, grenades, and equipment for men who could not count on resupply after landing, gave the fabric a loose, baggy appearance around the legs that German soldiers found visually distinctive enough to comment on in multiple separate accounts. Gefreiter Anton Reiss, a German infantryman captured during the Normandy campaign nearly a year later, told his American interrogators, in a transcript later declassified and studied by military historians, that the phrase had been circulating among German units in Sicily before his own unit ever encountered the 82nd directly. He said, "We had heard about them before we saw them. The men who fought them called them devils in baggy pants, and they said it the way you would describe something you respected and feared in equal measure. When my own unit finally faced them in Normandy, I understood immediately why the name had followed them across an entire ocean of fighting." This is an important detail because it suggests the nickname was not a piece of American self-mythology retrofitted after the war, but a designation that traveled through German military channels well ahead of the Normandy invasion, carried by officers and enlisted men who had personally experienced what the division was capable of and felt compelled to warn units who had not yet faced them. General der Fallschirmtruppe Eugen Meindl, commanding German airborne forces and therefore uniquely positioned to evaluate an opposing airborne division on professional terms, reviewed intelligence on the 82nd prior to the Normandy campaign and reportedly noted in a briefing to subordinate commanders that American paratroopers should be assumed capable of offensive action within minutes of landing, regardless of how scattered or disorganized their drop appeared, a direct contradiction of the doctrinal assumption governing how most European airborne forces, including his own, were expected to behave under similar circumstances. If you're new to this channel, this is the kind of story we tell here. History recovered not from the winning side's memorials, but from the enemy's own reports, the version they never expected anyone else to read. If that's the kind of history you want more of, subscribing costs you nothing and tells us to keep digging through these archives. But what these early assessments failed to fully anticipate was how this pattern would repeat and intensify during the Normandy invasion itself, where the 82nd Airborne again experienced a badly scattered drop on the night of June 5th into June 6th, 1944, with elements landing across a wide area around the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, frequently isolated in small groups deep inside German-held territory, with no immediate prospect of reinforcement from the seaborne invasion force still fighting to establish itself on the beaches. Oberst Günther Kiel, a German officer responsible for the defense of the sector around Sainte-Mère-Église, filed an assessment during the battle's opening days that echoed the Sicily reports with almost uncanny precision. He wrote, "Scattered American parachute forces continue offensive operations against this sector, despite what our reconnaissance indicates is a severely fragmented command structure and limited ammunition supply. Rational military calculation would suggest these isolated elements should prioritize survival and await link-up with the main invasion force. This is not occurring. Isolated groups, in several documented instances numbering fewer than a dozen men, continue to initiate contact with numerically superior German positions." Read that sentence again. A German colonel is reporting to his own high command that small groups of American paratroopers, cut off, undersupplied, and facing forces that should have overwhelmed them by simple weight of numbers, were choosing to attack rather than hide, and that this behavior was occurring consistently enough to constitute a pattern rather than a series of isolated incidents. It never behaved like doctrine predicted, not once. Among the individual accounts populating the German record of the Normandy fighting, one detail recurs with particular frequency concerning the town of Sainte-Mère-Église itself, which elements of the 82nd's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment secured in the early morning hours of June 6th, making it, according to most historical accounts, the first town liberated in continental Europe during the invasion. German forces, attempting to retake the town in the hours that followed, encountered a defense that, according to Oberst Kiel's continuing reports, demonstrated an unusual capacity to absorb losses and counterattacks without losing overall cohesion of the defensive position. He wrote, "Repeated counterattacks against this position have failed to dislodge the defenders, despite achieving what our own casualty assessments suggest should have been sufficient attrition to force a withdrawal or surrender. The defending force appears to reorganize its remaining strength after each assault rather than consolidating toward a smaller, weaker perimeter, which is the behavior our doctrine would predict from a unit under this degree of sustained pressure." However, the tactical picture that German intelligence eventually assembled from prisoner interrogations conducted throughout the Normandy campaign revealed a further dimension to this pattern that officers found difficult to categorize using standard psychological assessments of enemy combatants. Hauptmann Rudolf Lenz, an intelligence officer tasked with compiling interrogation summaries from paratroopers captured during the fighting around Sainte-Mère-Église, wrote in a report that was later recovered and translated by Allied historians studying the campaign. He noted, "Prisoners from the American parachute infantry demonstrate a consistent unwillingness to disparage their own unit's chances or leadership, even under interrogation conditions specifically designed to elicit such disparagement. This consistency across multiple prisoners taken from different companies and different engagements suggests an institutional characteristic rather than the individual bravado we would expect from isolated instances. We have not observed this consistency in prisoners taken from other Allied infantry formations operating in this sector." The withdrawal of German forces from the broader Cotentin Peninsula sector in the weeks following the initial Normandy landings has been analyzed extensively by military historians studying the campaign, and several post-war German assessments specifically identify the persistent, aggressive resistance of American airborne units, including the 82nd, as a contributing factor in the collapse of the German defensive timetable for the region. General der Infanterie Wilhelm Falley, killed early in the campaign before he could file a comprehensive assessment, had reportedly remarked to his staff shortly before his death that the airborne landings represented a fundamentally different problem than a conventional beach assault, precisely because the scattered nature of the drop made it functionally impossible to identify a coherent front line to defend against. His successor's staff, compiling a retrospective analysis after the campaign's conclusion, wrote, "The American parachute divisions operating in this sector did not require battlefield cohesion in the conventional sense to achieve their operational objectives. Their effectiveness derived from a distributed capacity for aggressive action that our doctrine, built around the assumption that disorganization produces defensive caution, did not adequately anticipate or counter." What the German record ultimately preserves, across regimental reports, intelligence memoranda, and the post-war reflections of officers who fought against the division in two separate campaigns on two separate continents, is not primarily a story of American numerical or technological superiority in either Sicily or Normandy. In both campaigns, the scattered, disorganized nature of the airborne drops meant the 82nd frequently fought while badly outnumbered, undersupplied, and cut off from any reliable chain of command. It is a more specific story about a particular military institution that had trained its individual soldiers to treat isolation, scattered deployment, and uncertain odds not as conditions requiring caution, but as circumstances requiring continued aggressive initiative, a doctrine so consistently contrary to conventional military assumptions about how isolated infantry behaves that German officers across two campaigns, writing home in the careful and unsentimental language of professional soldiers, kept reaching for the same word to describe what they had encountered. Not soldiers, devils. Teufel in Reithosen. Devils in Baggy Pants, a name given first as a warning between German units and remembered afterward on both sides of the war as the closest thing available in either language to an accurate description of what the 82nd Airborne Division had actually been.